How you doing today? I'm Tim. Hi. And we're in the final week of our series called The Good Life. And I have to admit, I'm already ready for the next series, but not because this one's not been awesome. It's just we've been putting Christmas lights up and Christmas trees, and it's got me in a different headspace. And I think I made a joke that wasn't, well, it was a joke at my expense, but it was also true at the same time, that I had been looking on YouTube about how to hang Christmas lights on your house without dying. That's what I put in the search. That's not what I put in the search. I don't know why anyone would search that, but anyway, actually I do know why. Because I don't like being on a ladder, but I had that experience yesterday. We put up our tree and put stuff up inside the house, and my son Leo is all about Christmas lights right now. I'm not sure it's ever going to end. He's been asking, in fact, since people put Halloween displays up now, he's been seeing Halloween lights on people and saying Christmas lights. He's been that ready for it for a while. So I was like, I have to try to do something. And at one point, I had a spot where I didn't think I would be able to get my ladder, and I contemplated getting on the roof. I don't like heights. I should add that. So it wasn't exactly the being on the roof part that bothered me. It was the going from ladder to roof. Anybody else have that experience? I just had a buddy recently that I've known of people that fell off ladders, and I'm like, my middle name's Alan, and that's not a joke either for you Home Improvement fans, if you added it. So I'm the person that would fall off the ladder. Anyway, we have lights up on our house after all that, and they're fun to look at. And we took a drive around the neighborhood to look at all the houses that did it better than we did. So Leo could be amazed at somebody else's lights on their house. But actually, this was cool though. This actually happened. At one point we circled around our neighborhood to go to another part of the neighborhood, and as we were coming up past our house on the drive, Leo was like, "Oh, here comes another cool-looking house," and I was like, "Buddy, that's our house, and it does look cool." Yeah. All right. So I at least amazed the 3-year-old. So, as a segue, Leo is in a phase of life right now where he's developing not only independence, but he wants to be able to do things that he oftentimes physically can't do. Like we went across the street after the big light excursion, after putting them up, before we did the drive around, to meet some neighbors that we hadn't met, and they have a 3-year-old also. And so the 3-year-old was with another boy in the neighborhood that was older and was shooting hoops in the back, and we tried to get Leo to do it, but Leo found that he wasn't capable of getting the ball up in the hoop. So he decided to play a different game, which was roll the ball down the hill and chase after it, which the other kids that wanted to actually play basketball, I thought they were going to lose it, but they ended up playing the down the hill game with him, so that was very nice of them. But the downside to this is sometimes a 3-year-old, when they can't do the thing that they want to do, this is going to shock you all, they lose it. And I don't just mean like, they want what they want and they get mad that you won't get it. I'm saying like, we had a smaller like marble maze, and he tried to put it together on his own to roll marbles down it, and pieces kept falling off. And at one point he just picked up the whole thing and just chucked it in the ground, started crying because he couldn't put it together properly. A third instance of this, although he didn't lose it, but he really wanted to touch the star on top of our tree. But I don't know if you know, 3-year-olds don't have like NBA height. So he couldn't reach. So he started jumping up. I need you to pick me up so I can reach it. So I lifted him up so he could touch the tree, and he just tapped it real quick, and he was like, all right, I'm good. That's all I needed to do. You know, it's funny because when you think about a 3-year-old not being able to do something and them getting agitated by it, it's at times cute, and at other times, if I had hair, I would want to rip it out. But I shaved it off, so I don't have to do that. But basically, you know, we can laugh at a 3-year-old doing that. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, many of us attempt to try to do things, want to do better at things, want to change things, and yet we find ourselves repeatedly incapable of getting to where we want to go, achieving what we want to achieve, doing what we want to do, maybe even falling back into habits that we don't want to be doing anymore. And I don't know about you, but you know, when I'm in that kind of place, I can get frustrated. Maybe not throw the maze parts down and cry in a puddle of tears, kind of frustrated. It depends on the situation. But I can get very frustrated that I feel like I'm taking a step backward, or that I'm not able to, you know, hit the mark that I want to hit. And, you know, in this series, The Good Life, as we've been studying through the book of Ezra, this book is written about a people returning from exile. And if you've been following, not just in this series, but in the series that we've done throughout this year, we've talked a lot about the people of God and the way that God has brought them up and told them to live this good life in obedience to Him, and yet they are incapable at every turn of following through. They're constantly taking steps backwards or just outright going off the path. And this becomes a problem on repeat for them. And so eventually, despite the warnings, they end up in destruction and exile. The Babylonians come in and they conquer and they wipe out not only the people and take them out of their land, but they wipe out their place of worship. And yet there's this remnant that God is going to allow to come back into the land. And when we get to the book of Ezra, these people are trying to reestablish themselves in their home. And they're not only trying to reestablish themselves in their home, but they're trying to reestablish the good life. They are trying to reestablish right ways of worship, and they're trying to walk in step with God so that they don't revert back to the ways that got them put in the state of exile to begin with. And as we've detailed this book, and it's an odd book. It can feel choppy if you read through it. There are points of genealogy. There are points of worship practice that we're not accustomed to. And even as we're going to see today, sometimes the story can go from narrating about Ezra to being from the first person perspective of Ezra. And so it gets a little bit choppy to read. But essentially, if you read through this book, what you find is that the people start off on the right foot. They get back, and they don't try to reconstruct their place of worship, but try to reconstruct their practices of worship before anything. And then this guy Ezra comes along, and as we learned about him last week, he's a person that's got a family lineage that just screams leader, and he ends up taking up that task, and he comes to instill the practices of the people. He seeks to not only learn the scriptures himself, but to live them out and to lead others to do the same. That was our key from last week. Learn, live, and lead from Ezra. And so you might think that all this is going to end well, right? But if you know me by now, when I get that smile, that means it's not going to end well. You see, by the time you get to the end of the book of Ezra, Ezra is coming, he's trying to establish these practices. And when we get to chapter 9, which we're going to look at today, he receives a devastating report. The people have done something that they ought not to have done. And I'm going to admit to you that when we look at this, it's a little bit of a controversial subject that becomes controversial because it's been read or taken or even applied the wrong way. And we'll talk about that openly here. But ultimately, what we're going to figure out here is that despite the will of the people to go the right path, to not end up going backward, to not end up veering off the path, and to not end up in exile again, their will lacks the power. And that becomes problematic. And so, if you're inclined to read along with me, I'll have some passages on the screen here. We're going to look at Ezra 9. We're actually going to look at the whole chapter and a few verses of chapter 10 this morning. I'll probably stop along the way at different breaks. So I want to read the first 4 verses here for just a moment. I'm reading from the New English Translation, by the way, if you are so inclined to follow, but that's what's on the screen here. So it says, "Now when these things had been completed, the leaders approached me," being Ezra, "and said, 'The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, have not separated themselves from the local residents who practice detestable things similar to those of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. Indeed, they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy race has become intermingled with the local residents. Worse still, the leaders and the officials have been at the forefront of all this unfaithfulness. When I heard this report, I tore my tunic and my robe and ripped out some of my hair from my head and beard. Then I sat down quite devastated. Everyone who held the words of the God of Israel in awe gathered around me because of the unfaithful acts of the people of the exile. Devastated, I continued to sit there until the evening offering." All right, something's gone awry here. So a couple things. I'll deal with the lighthearted part and then the less lighthearted part in a second. When you study this passage, the point at which Ezra has found out about this wrongdoing is about the ninth month into his time here. It's very likely that this wasn't his first time hearing about this issue. And so a lot of scholars that read this passage have considered or assumed or speculated that Ezra might be putting on a show more than acting out of like a very guttural reaction here. What he's doing, this whole, tearing his clothes and pulling out his hair and his beard, that would hurt. Those are acts of mourning in this culture. Acts of mourning. It was commonplace for people when they lost a loved one to go through a grieving state, and part of that would be a very outward expression of sorrow. And the way to do that is the tearing of clothes, the ripping out of hair. Now, a lot of people in this culture would do the shaving of the head. I'm not in mourning right now; it's just my hairstyle. But they would do that sort of thing. But there are prohibitions against putting razor to head. So what does he do? He pulls his hair out, and I don't know if he got a big chunk of it or just found one little strand. Either one might hurt. I don't know if he had tweezers. All I know is whether for real or to put on a display, he is showing an outward sign of grief over the situation. And the reason I also hone in on these actions being outward signs of mourning is because this is a leader that has come to a people that have literally faced devastation and exile, and they're coming back. And so this is an outward expression of a loss that hasn't happened yet. Because there's an anticipation, this has gone off trail, and we know what happens when people go off the mark. They end up in exile. This is horrible. I'm going to put on display of outward grief over this situation. But we also find out what the situation is. And if you read Deuteronomy 7, you'll know that I believe 7 of the 8, I think there are 8 places counted there, are actually places that God had told the people not to intermarry with. And they're now listed here. And of course, the language here in the Hebrew really could be rendered holy seed instead of holy race, but the point still stands. What the people have done is they've come back from exile and they've begun to marry the people groups around them. Now, if you remember when they were setting up shop and putting their altar back in place, they were actually afraid that they were going to do their worship exposed by the peoples that are around them. And so one of the reasons to be afraid of that is because you don't want to be attacked by people that have a problem with you doing your thing in this space when they want you to just start doing their thing. But another reason to be afraid of being in that sort of situation is that you might feel like you're going to get roped into doing what the people around you are interested in doing. Because if you're supposed to stand out and be set apart, to be different, to live for God and not in the ways of the world around you, it's a very real fear that to be back in the middle of people groups that you were plucked out of in the first place could cause you the temptation to fall back in to some bad habits. Which is what makes this situation worse. You see, where this gets controversial is people have used passages like this to argue against, intermarrying racially and things of that sort. And they've done that based off of a misunderstanding of this phrase, holy seed here. This is not about racial issues. By the way, the people of God were Semitic people like all the people that are named on this list. It's not about that. It's about religious practices and where they lead. And it's also about power and influence. You see, in our world, when when a guy meets a girl and they like each other, and then they like each other, and then they fall in love, and then they spend way too much money on a party. No, I'm just kidding. And they do that whole sort of thing, Everyone loves that. And that's all good and stuff, but when you get married in our modern culture, most of the time you don't marry into like an economic and power and family ties situation. Yeah, we extend our family, but you do your own thing. But in this culture, that's not how it worked. If you married into another family, what belonged to you now belongs to them. There was an economic reality at play. Not only that, but the home system necessitated some issues. You'll notice here that when it mentions that the people intermarried, it hones in on the sons being given the women from these other places as their wives. Did you catch that in the reading there? Why is that pointed out? Well, there are two reasons. One, typically speaking, in that culture it was expected that the wife, the mother in the situation, was going to be the influence over the children that were born into that situation. So imagine you give your son off to a woman that practices a different religious system than you. What is she going to educate your children with? The ways of God or the pagan ways of the world around you? It goes further, though, because you see, in that culture, there were issues of inheritance. When people died, property, material possessions went into the family. And therefore, what belonged to God's people could end up belonging to the peoples that they weren't supposed to intermingle with because of this situation. There was a lot more at stake with this practice. And so the issue is not about one person marrying another person and certain types of people being off limits. It's about a people being set apart to devote themselves to God. And in intermarrying, their devotion gets pulled away from God and into these other power structures and religious systems. Do you follow with me here on this? So this becomes a big problem. It's forbidden in Deuteronomy. Ezra, this scholar, knows this. The people ought to know this. He's come here to teach them, to lead them. They've come out of exile. They're trying to reestablish their way of life. They're trying to stay on the right path to God. And they have gone and they've broken one of the commands all the way back in Deuteronomy. And it's not just that they broke a command, but it's the implications involved in the breaking of that command that can lead to all sorts of trouble. It can lead them right back into the bad place that got them exiled in the first place. And so we continue in verse 5 here. And this is what it says in chapter 9, verse 5. It says, "At the time of the evening offering, I got up from my self-abasement with my tunic and robe torn, and then dropped to my knees and spread my hands to the Lord my God. I prayed, 'Oh my God, I am ashamed and embarrassed to lift my face to you, my God. For our iniquities have climbed higher than our heads, and our guilt extends to the heavens. From the days of our fathers until this very day, our guilt has been great. Because of our iniquities, we, along with our kings and priests, have been delivered over by the local kings to sword, captivity, plunder, and embarrassment, right up to the present time. But now briefly we have received mercy from the Lord our God, and that he has left us a remnant and has given us a secure position in his holy place. Thus our God has enlightened our eyes and has given us a little relief in our time of servitude. Although we are slaves, our God has not abandoned us in our servitude. He has extended kindness to us in the sight of the kings of Persia, and that he has revived us to restore the temple of our God and to raise up its ruins and to give us a protective wall in Judah and Jerusalem. And now that we are able to say after this our God, and what are we able to say after this our God? For we have forsaken our commandments, which you commanded us through your servants, the prophets, with these words. The land that you are entering to possess is a land defiled by the impurities of the local residents. With their abominations they have filled it from one end to the other with their filthiness. Therefore do not give your daughters in marriage to their sons, and do not take their daughters in marriage for your sons. Do not ever seek their peace or welfare, so that you may be strong and may eat the good of the land and may leave it as an inheritance for your children forever. Everything that has happened to us has come about because of our wicked actions and our great guilt. Even so, our God, you have exercised restraint toward our iniquities and have given us a remnant such as this. Shall we once again break your commandments and intermarry with these abominable peoples? Would you not be so angered by us that you would wipe us out with no survivor or remnant? O Lord God of Israel, you are righteous, for we are left as a remnant to this day. Indeed, we stand before you in our guilt. However, because of this guilt, no one can really stand before you." So in that prayer of Ezra, He goes from praying on a personal note, he's bearing the weight of the sin, even though we don't get the impression that he participated in this. But when you read the report that he received, it wasn't just some random people. The people all the way up to leadership were participating in this problem here. And so when Ezra prays to God, he not only prays on his own behalf, but he's praying for the community collectively to God. And he goes back and forth, being grateful and thankful to God for bringing them back, for sparing them, for giving them the grace of being a remnant and coming back and reestablishing themselves. And yet you can hear the pain and the sorrow and the concern in his prayer, because he tells God, he says, so you've done this great thing for us, and this is what we've turned around and done. Can we even expect you to continue to be graceful to us in this moment? He concludes in that prayer, he's like, can we really stand before you? And so this is a rough situation for Ezra. He's been brought here to lead. The people have seemed open. That's why they were the remnant. They were the people that desired, that had the will to get back on track with God. And yet, in their moment of concern, their moment of fear, they reverted back to their ways. And you might ask yourselves, well, why would the people do this? And I know I've said this before, but, people have a tendency to try to fast track their circumstances to make them better. If you are a people in exile and you've been brought back from exile, it doesn't say that they were brought back with everything that they need to thrive. They didn't have all their stuff. They didn't probably have a lot of money to get stuff. They were in a bad circumstance. Yeah, they were back home, but they had nothing to show for it. And so what do? Well, we can wait and hope things get better. Or we could marry into or give ourselves into marriage with these other people around here and get some of what they have. That'll work out, right? No, it won't. But that's what's going on here. They've decided yet again to make the same decision that got them in trouble in the first place. This was their repeat pattern problem. All the way back to 1 Samuel. Give us a king like the other nations so that we can what? Be like the other nations. Oh God, thank you for bringing us back out of exile. That was really great, but we'd like to have what all the other nations have. So let's just go ahead and do this now. That's what's going on here. And whether Ezra found out in that moment or knew about it already, the reality of it smacks him in the face. He tears his clothes, he rips out his hair, and he falls to his knees in prayer, not just on his own behalf, but on the people's behalf, because he realizes God has done something good to bring them here. And the people, as we are all accustomed to doing, are about to ruin it all over again. And that leads us to the last 4 verses of this section here, and that's the first 4 verses of chapter 10. It says, while Ezra was praying and confessing, weeping and throwing himself to the ground before the temple of God, a very large crowd of Israelites, men, women, and children alike, gathered around him. The people wept loudly. Then Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, from the descendants of Elam, addressed Ezra. We have been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women from the local peoples. Nevertheless, there is still hope for Israel in this regard. Therefore, let us enact a covenant with our God to send away all these women and their offspring in keeping with your counsel, my Lord, and that of those who respect the commandments of our God. And let it be done according to the law. Get up, for this matter concerns you. We are with you, so be strong and act decisively. So the people see Ezra, their leader, distraught, weeping, in prayer, concerned, torn robe, ripped out hair strand, chunk of hair, I don't know. Not a good situation. They realize the gravity of the situation and they come up with a solution. We'll just get rid of the families. I guess that's one way to do it. But that's a really bad Band-Aid on a gaping, blood-oozing wound. Sorry for the mental picture there. It's not going to work. You want to know why? Because it's just dealing with the surface issue. It's not dealing with what led them to go that direction in the first place. And yet, I got bad news for you. Chapter 10 is the last chapter of Ezra. And if you go on reading, what you end in is a section that names off the list of people that took foreign wives. That's the end of the book. A real heart warmer. What are we to do? What are we to do? Well, the reality is if you follow the whole story that we've been following and beyond, if you go all the way back to Genesis, but even if you just start in 1 Samuel where we started way back when, and you keep going on, you'll find that there is a core problem not only with the Israelites, but with people. Even the most do-gooding types, those that have the will, those that have the willpower to do what is good, lack the power on their own to do it. That's why our bottom line for today is that when we have the will but lack the power, God provides the power to live out His will. When we have the will but lack the power, God provides the power to live out His will. Our solutions probably aren't going to get the job done. Yeah, the people can send the people away because that won't create more destruction. There's nothing better, right, than just completely dismantling a family. That's really going to fix the world. It won't. But that's the thing. They just want to deal with the surface level issue. And the reason why really is the whole reason that they got into that mess in the first place is because they wanted things to go well for them. And when they realize or are reminded that things don't go well for you when you deviate from God's plan, they think, well, it doesn't matter who we hurt, we'll just get rid of the problem and then things will go well for us. And at the end of the day, all they're concerned about is things going well for them. Which is why in the bottom line here, I point out here that when we have the will but lack the power, God provides the power to live out His will, not ours. Which is actually the root of the problem in the first place. You know, at the beginning, I used my son as an example. You know, he's a little 3-year-old and doesn't have the height and doesn't have the mental capacity yet, doesn't have the dexterity with his hands to do everything that he wants to do. But the will is there. But he needs something bigger than himself. He needs someone to delicately put the parts of the maze together so that it doesn't tumble over. He needs someone to pick him up so that he can reach the star on top of the tree. I don't fault him for being upset. None of us like not being able to do the things that we want to do, especially when what we want to do is good and right. So I ask again, like I asked at the beginning, anybody else in here ever get stuck walking backward when you want to move forward, when you want to improve, when you want to do what's right, when you want to stop doing something that has a stronghold on you? It's very frustrating. Very much frustrating. I know I have my own issues with those things. I often tell people that my biggest sin issue is worry. You know, Jesus actually says, don't worry. It's a command. And I've shared with you all that I deal with anxiety. And the funny thing about anxiety is anxiety itself isn't the problem. As I've learned that worry and fear are the problem. And oftentimes, they're really rooted in a fear of losing control. And if I get down to it, most of my bad habits and bad actions and bad words root themselves in a fear of losing control. Fear that I can't control my own betterment. Fear that I can't control what happens to those that I love. Oh my gosh, you want to get me going? You want my kid to get me going? Whew. Running too fast from room to room when I can clearly see, or I think I can clearly see, is going to smack into a wall. Whew. Especially after I have to tell him 3 times. Then I start doing the angry dad thing. I start yelling. And I don't stop until I get his attention, which isn't exactly what I want to do in the first place. Because he has to learn the hard way sometimes, as I've heard from someone in the room before. B, the outcome I'm worried about might not be the outcome. He might learn to be able to navigate where he's going quickly. Yeah, exactly. See? You can pile it on. I can take it. We're good. But the thing is, as much as I don't want to react that way, it's so much easier for me to revert right back to the thing I don't want to do, to try to fix a problem that I think is going to be a problem. And I could reel off a bunch of different examples, but you get the point. All of us might want to try to help make the right outcome happen, want to try to do the right thing, want to stop doing the wrong thing, and yet no matter how hard we try, we lack the might to do it on our own. It's easy to read the story of the Israelites and think, oh, these knuckleheads. They saw God do miraculous things, pulling them out of Egypt. They saw him do miraculous things in the wilderness while they were roaming. They saw him do wonderful things through the heroes of their faith, and yet they keep reverting back again and again and again to doing it the wrong way and to doing the wrong things. And we look at that, and we could look as if we're looking down from the bird's eye view onto the pages and say, what are you even doing? But if we're really honest with ourselves, we should be reading and saying, oh my gosh, I see myself right there. Because no matter how grand in scale or small in scale the things we struggle with are, we can relate. When we have the will but lack the power, we need something bigger than us to lift us up, to fix what's broken, and to get us on our feet again. I told you at the beginning I am way too excited about the Christmas series. We're putting up lights and stuff. Sadly, even though Ezra is one of my favorite people in the Old Testament because I I love a Bible geek that tries to help people learn and live out their faith. I want to emulate that. Ultimately, while we need each other, as I said last week, because it's who you know, not what you know. You remember that anyway? The truth is that we need something beyond ourselves. Because if we don't have what's beyond ourselves, we'll keep falling back into the same patterns again and again and again. And that's what happened to the people. And all of a sudden, if you keep reading through the Old Testament, it just stops. There's all the warning, all the calamity. And then there's this period of time before Jesus comes along. And things didn't improve much by the time Jesus got there. But that's the key. By the time Jesus gets there. See, next week, we're going to start our Christmas series called Noel, which is a word that means to be born. And we're going to contemplate the birth of Jesus. Because the reality is that God doesn't leave us stuck without power. He has given us the power through His Son and through His Spirit to live out His will. And that is a wonderful, wonderful story. He doesn't leave His people to their own devices, their own frailty, and their own faults. He doesn't leave us alone. He sends His Son to be God with us. So I hope you'll come back next week as we start doing that. In the meantime, though, to remember what Jesus has done for us, I hope that you grab communion on your way in. Communion is something that Jesus commanded His disciples to do in remembrance of Him when He was around the Passover meal with them. Taking bread and breaking it, He gave it to them and said, "This is His body, which is given for them and for us." And taking the cup and passing it and saying, "This is His blood poured out for you." And that is the most wonderful example of God not leaving us to our own devices. Because He sent His one and only Son, that whosoever believes in Him will not perish but will have everlasting life. And I want to emphasize the life. Because while it is everlasting, it is wonderful to contemplate what that will be like in the long run. Jesus came to give us life that begins now. When we believe in Him, when we trust in Him. And when we take communion, it's our act of faith to not only do what He commanded us to do in taking of these elements, but also to profess our faith to one another and to embolden us to continue to live it out. And so I just want us to take a brief moment to contemplate what God has done for us through Jesus. And then after that brief time, we will take communion together, the bread and the juice. I invite you to join me in taking this bread and eat. This is His body, which is given for us. And in the same way, I invite you to take and drink from this cup. This is His blood, which is poured out for us. Please join me in prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for another Sunday to worship together as a church family. I thank you for being able to look at Christmas lights and to gear up for this season where we get to embrace a warm message despite the cold in the air. But Lord, I also know that this season can be a great shot in the arm for some, but that is also a season that is a struggle. Because in trying to embrace the warmth, we're reminded of our own struggles, we're reminded of our hurts, our pains, our broken relationships, the brokenness that we experience. And so, Lord, I pray that while we embrace the fun of the season, as I've got to do the last couple days, I pray, God, that you will help us to go beyond and to embrace the goodness that you are to us in sending your Son, Jesus. That it is, in fact, the greatest story ever told. And not only that, but what you've done for us has given us life. Life that we simply cannot have of our own merit and of our own strength. And I thank you so much that you had that kind of grace and still do for us. I pray, God, that message, as we look toward it this season, will not only enlighten us, give us strength, but I pray that the reality of that story coming to life in our life will give us the strength to honor you in all that we say and do. And we pray these things in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.